Hi everyone, Phil Travis here, your instructor here at EOU, Civil War and Reconstruction. This week we are going to be looking at a number of things, but this week's lesson will be on the end of the war, 1864 to 1865. So, in 1864 and 65, the war really became a war of attrition, a total war from the northern perspective. To say that something is a war of attrition um, means that the victor of the war will be the one that can sacrifice the most in the battle. The victor in the war will be the one that can outlast the other. And this was, at any point, this was really a kind of war that the South could not win. And in 1864, it was particularly a war that the South could not win. The Union in 1864 and 65 really moves to a strategy of waging war on all fronts. The Anaconda Plan, the blockade plan that had begun in 1861, really at the beginning of the war, was solidified in 1864. And particularly with the capture of forts like Fort Fisher, um, the Anaconda Plan really became a very, very effective blockade. And the South was increasingly being starved of supplies at this time. Similarly, the Union economy was booming. The Union economy produced record amounts of wheat. There was a California gold rush that was contributing to the Union economy. And so there were manufacturers that made tremendous money on war supplies. And in a lot of cases, the Civil War was a jumpstart for industry in the North. So the Union economy was really booming. The North, the Union, demanded a policy of unconditional surrender, which means that the um, the Union reserved the right to demand that the South surrender on the North's terms, on the Union's terms. And of course, Lincoln and Lee, briefly, there was a flirtation with a peace agreement in 1864. Of course, Lincoln proposed a rather gracious version of unconditional surrender, in which the South had to acknowledge things like emancipation, that these things would be true and they would be the future, and that the South had to, um, accept the principle of union and so forth. But of course, Lincoln also suggested compensation to slave owners who had lost slaves, and Lincoln's strategy for Reconstruction was, in retrospect, actually um, quite lenient on the South in terms of allowing Southerners back into the Union. But Davis, of course, refuses unconditional surrender. Unconditional surrender means that the country that Davis is the president of ceases to exist. Um, and so Davis never feels he can accept unconditional surrender. And of course, despite his advisors, um, despite his advisors' concerns, Davis, of course, really lambasted Lincoln about this. He called him a king and suggested that the Union was waging some kind of an unnecessary conflict when peace was possible. And of course, um, that very much stirred up the motive for war in the South for a brief period of time. But in reality, it really extended the war. It prolonged the war. Davis's refusal really to accept the ultimate, the inevitable, that the war was over, that the South was defeated, and unfortunately, um, Davis not being able to come to terms with this in 1864 meant that the war would carry on to quite devastating effect for over another year. The South was really decimated. It was really decimated economically. The Southern troops were tired. They were, compared to Union troops, were almost malnourished. And the South suffered greatly. Ulysses S. Grant, however, was given the post of lieutenant general in the North, given supreme command of the military operations. He was commander of the Army of Potomac. The Union had finally found a competent leader, and Grant's plan, of course, was to destroy the Army of Northern Virginia. And this really began with Grant's Wilderness Campaign in 1864 and the Petersburg Campaign, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. The South was engaged simultaneously. The Southern Army was engaged in Tennessee. It was engaged in Virginia. It was engaged in terms of blockade. And, of course, it was engaged by Sherman's troops on the interior of Georgia and South Carolina. Sherman's march to the sea was a total war effort, and Sherman had to convince Grant of this, and Grant had to convince Lincoln of this. But Sherman's plan had been, it was really a plan of total war. And so what Sherman did was to first cut through Georgia, and the idea was to take from the Confederacy their ability to support the war effort, whether in material, in supplies, or in terms of its will. And so when you look at Sherman's march, it really was part of a strategic effort at total war. And of course, its worst, the most devastating elements of Sherman's march were really demonstrated when Sherman went into South Carolina. South Carolina was far more devastating than Georgia, and many of Sherman's troops had actively sought to punish South Carolina, which they felt South Carolina was really the state that was at fault for the whole thing. Of course, there was much devastation wrought in Georgia, but nothing that compared to South Carolina. And Sherman's troops largely left alone North Carolina. South Carolina was very much targeted, and the populace and the towns and the countryside was very much pillaged in Georgia, but far more so in South Carolina. This is an image from Columbia. The most infamous component of Sherman's march through the Carolinas was Columbia. Columbia was burned and destroyed in 1865. This is an image of the aftermath. Here is a newspaper depiction as well of it. Columbia was completely devastated. Now, why this happened, historians have never been able to know for certain. There's always been debate, whether was it Union forces, was it Confederate forces, and the reality is we'll never know, but the truth of the matter is that responsibility for the fires that burned Columbia likely fell with both sides, Confederates and Union forces. And of course, when you look at Sherman's troops in South Carolina, it would be of no great surprise to have seen the burning of a place like this, as many towns and homes were in farm fields were destroyed. But of course, this was an aspect, a component of a total war. And one has to really ask, the war really, the South was truly defeated effectively in 1864. And it's really, I think, tragic that the war would carry on for another year. And one has to wonder if only it had been possible for Davis to have accepted the peace terms in 1864. This map shows you kind of the dwindling scope of the Confederacy. You can see the shaded areas that depict Sherman's march to the sea through Georgia. You can see the areas that depict the loss of area around Richmond and by Petersburg, where Petersburg was sieged. The final major campaign of the Civil War is really Petersburg. And I have Petersburg listed here from 1864 to 1865. And that's really because Petersburg is less a single battle than it is a series of battles that are generally around the areas of Richmond to Petersburg. It's oftentimes been depicted and called a siege. Oftentimes it's called the Siege of Petersburg. In truth, it really wasn't a traditional siege. It was much, much more like a World War I, like Western Front style battlefield. Instead of a traditional siege where you might have an army occupying a city and the city surrounded, Petersburg was a case in which Grant fought Lee's forces in a series of battles, and ultimately Lee and Grant's forces dug these trenches alongside of each other, and Grant continually extended his trenches and his forces in outflanking Lee and ultimately cutting Lee's supplies. But it was much more like a World War I style battlefield almost than it was a Civil War, or what you think about being a Civil War battlefield. You see another image of that here. You see this Union rail siege artillery. This is a siege mortar. It was called the Dictator. It was obviously moved on the rail line, and it just gives you a kind of an idea of what you're going to see in World War One, some 50 years or so later, with the heavy siege artillery that was used on the Western Front as that trench warfare in World War One carried out. So in many respects, Petersburg was an example of really a stalemated, well, maybe not truly stalemated, but a slow-moving industrial war in which the Confederate forces were ground down. Rather malnourished Confederate forces were just whittled back by the superior firepower and the superior supplied Union forces of Grant. Lee ultimately fled Petersburg after the Union forces cut his supply lines, and he had hoped to head south into North Carolina, where he could link up with Johnston and maybe make another defense somewhere else. But of course, this fails, and Lee was forced into Petersburg, and he is ultimately forced to surrender to Grant there. Lee ultimately surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, the McLean House, on April 9th, 1865. Lee had been in Petersburg after being pushed away from the Wilderness Campaign. Lee is in Petersburg. Grant surrounds Petersburg and is sieging Petersburg. Lee ultimately is forced out of Petersburg, and he flees to the west of Virginia, and he was hoping to get down and be able to turn and go down south into North Carolina, where he could meet up with other Southern forces to combine their forces and concentrate their defensive efforts further south. But as you can see depicted in the blue lines, the Northern armies consistently made that impossible for Lee to do, and they pursued Lee until Appomattox, and at Appomattox, Lee accepts, Lee accepts Grant's terms of surrender. Ulysses S. Grant pictured here, and of course Robert E. Lee. Grant's terms of surrender were quite gracious. He allowed Confederate soldiers to return home. He allowed officers to, obviously soldiers had to turn in their arms, though he allowed officers to keep their sidearms. He allowed them to take their horses. Confederate forces were saluted by the Union forces as Grant signs this surrender, and the defeat of the Army of Northern Virginia really marked the end of the war. Of course, shortly thereafter, Lincoln would be assassinated. There was some intent from Jefferson Davis to continue to try to struggle, but the war was really over after Lee surrenders on April 9th, 1865. And of course, Lincoln will be assassinated several days later, and the United States will descend into the difficult period of Reconstruction. So I hope this is helpful, guys. I hope this kind of, helps us think a little bit about the Civil War. The Civil War was a devastating conflict for Americans. Americans lost more people in this war than any other conflict. Accepted estimates are 620,000. Some estimates have gone up to over 700,000 of Americans killed, not to mention the thousands and thousands of Americans who were maimed, who suffered amputations, which was something like, I think it was like 18%, I believe it is, suffered amputations. It's a devastating war, and the shock of this war to the American people is we've continued to have to deal with the tragedy of this war in coming decades, and we still today live with some of the influence of the Civil War in the United States. So it's a devastating war that cost a tremendous amount of lives, and for a military history class, it's a war that is really embodied as it's an industrial war of attrition. Industrial warfare meant massive killing on a scale that was really unprecedented. And when you look at World War I, you see it go to even another level. But the Civil War really was a total industrial war with massive human consequences. Anyway, I hope this is helpful, guys. Let me know if you have any questions.